Seasons passed quietly in Haven Valley. The green hills turned golden in summer, soft in autumn, and white with gentle frost when winter came. Life moved at a calm pace, and the days no longer felt heavy to Lyra. Each morning she woke with the soft light of dawn touching her face, the sound of birds filling the air. She would open the door, breathe the cool air, and feel that she truly belonged there. Evan's farm grew busier as time went on. The nearby villagers began to visit more often, asking for his help with machines or trade. They had grown used to Lyra's presence too. At first they only smiled politely, unsure how to treat her, but as weeks became months they saw her kindness. She helped fix fences, carried food to the elderly, and played with the children who visited. The villagers started greeting her with real warmth. Some even brought her small gifts, seeds, bread, and hand-woven cloth. She would thank them shyly, her ears flicking slightly whenever she smiled, which made the children laugh with joy. Evan often watched her from a distance. He could see how far she had come from the frightened girl who had once stood silent at the auction. She spoke clearly now, her eyes bright and sure. She worked with quiet strength and sometimes even teased him when he dropped his tools or forgot where he left his cup of coffee. "Getting old, Evan," she would say softly, and he would laugh. They had built a small rhythm together. He repaired ships and traded supplies. She tended the garden and cared for the animals. In the evenings they shared tea on the porch. Sometimes they talked about small things, weather, crops, the stars. Other times they just sat in silence, comfortable in the peace between them. One evening, as the sunset painted the valley orange, Lyra asked, "Do you ever miss space?" Evan leaned back in his chair and looked toward the horizon. "Sometimes," he said. "It's quiet up there, but I think I've seen enough stars for one lifetime." She smiled softly. "You still have stars here?" she said, pointing to the sky. He chuckled. "You're right. Better ones too." Lyra often thought about how much had changed. There was still pain in her memories, but it no longer ruled her. The valley had given her something she never thought she'd have again: a future. She had friends, work, and peace. And above all, she had someone who had seen her not as a thing to own, but as a life worth saving. One day, a small transport ship arrived from the nearby town, carrying supplies. Among them were books, tools, and letters. Evan picked through the pile, then handed one envelope to Lyra. "This one's for you," he said. She blinked in surprise. "For me?" "It's from the village school," he explained. "They want help teaching the children about your world and your people, your songs." Lyra hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. "But I'm not a teacher." "You don't need to be," Evan said kindly. "Just tell them what you know. They'll listen." That night she stayed awake thinking about it. She looked at her reflection in the window and whispered, "Me? A teacher?" It felt strange but wonderful. The next morning she went to the small schoolhouse by the river. The children sat in a circle, wide-eyed and curious. She told them stories about the forests of her home planet, where the trees glowed softly at night and songs carried through the air like wind. She drew pictures in the sand to show them what her world looked like. The children listened with awe, asking question after question. By the time she finished, they clapped with excitement. One little girl hugged her leg and said, "Will you come back again?" Lyra smiled and nodded. "Yes, I will." When she returned home that evening, Evan was working near the workshop. She told him about the children, her voice full of life. He smiled quietly and said, "Looks like the valley found itself a new teacher." She laughed softly. "Maybe," she said, "but only because someone once taught me how to start over." As time went on, the school visits became regular. The villagers built her a small corner in the community center, where she could share songs and stories of the stars. People from nearby settlements even began to visit. They wanted to hear about the girl who had come from the stars and found peace on Earth's frontier. Through it all, Evan stayed the same, calm, steady, proud of her in his quiet way. One afternoon, as they walked by the river, Lyra stopped and looked at the reflection of the sky on the water. "You changed my life," she said softly. Evan smiled. "No, Lyra, you changed your own life. I just opened the door." She shook her head lightly. "You don't understand. I thought my life was over. Then you gave me a home, and now I have more than I ever dreamed." He looked at her for a moment and said gently, "Maybe that's what life is about, giving someone a chance to find themselves again." The wind moved through the grass around them, carrying the smell of flowers. Lyra felt a quiet peace settle over her heart. That evening she stood outside alone, watching the stars appear one by one. They no longer reminded her of cages or cold ships. Now they reminded her of journeys, of new beginnings, of how far she had come. She remembered the scared girl at the auction, unwanted, unseen, hopeless. And she whispered softly, "She's gone now." Evan joined her on the porch, 2 mugs of tea in his hands. "Talking to the stars again?" he asked. She smiled. "They listen better than people sometimes," he chuckled. "Maybe, but I think you've got plenty of listeners down here too." She took the cup and nodded. "Maybe I do." The night grew calm. The lights from the house glowed softly against the valley's dark fields. Somewhere, an owl called from the trees. Lyra turned toward Evan and said, "Thank you for everything." He looked up at the stars. "No need to thank me. You earned your peace." She watched him for a long moment, then looked back at the sky. The stars twinkled gently above them, like quiet witnesses to a promise fulfilled. And in that moment, Lyra understood something deep, that kindness could heal what power could not, that love did not need words or rules, and that one act of mercy could change an entire life. From then on, the valley people spoke often of the human and the silver-haired woman who lived in the hills. They said their farm was always open to travelers, always warm, always full of laughter and tea, and sometimes on clear nights they could hear her voice singing an old tune from her world, a song of light, freedom, and the stars that had once seemed so far away. Now they only reminded her of home. Life in Haven Valley grew calm and steady for Lyra. Days began with sunlight through the kitchen window and ended with quiet stars above the hills. She had learned how to work beside Evan, how to fix small things, and even how to laugh again. Every morning she would open the barn doors, feed the small creatures, and look toward the green hills that stretched beyond the fences. Sometimes, she still woke in the night from dreams she couldn't forget, dreams of the auction, the noise, the fear. But when she opened her eyes, she always saw the same old roof, the same warm light coming from the living room where Evan worked late. That small glow made her feel safe. One afternoon, the wind carried the sound of an engine. Lyra looked up from the garden and saw a small silver ship landing on the far field. It wasn't Evan's, and it didn't look like any local craft. Dust rose around it as it settled. Her heart started to race. Evan came out from the workshop, wiping his hands. He looked at the ship, his eyes calm but focused. "Stay here," he said softly. Lyra froze. "Who are they?" "Travelers, maybe," he said. "Or traders. Let's see." The ship's door opened and 3 strangers stepped out. They wore clean uniforms and had badges that marked them as off-world agents. One of them, a tall man with silver hair, smiled politely. "Good day," he called out. "We're looking for someone." Evan nodded slowly. "This is private land," he said. "Who are you looking for?" The man opened a small device and read from it. "A woman of non-human origin, silver hair, fox-like features, escaped property from the outer colonies." Lyra felt the ground sway under her feet. Her breath caught. She took a small step backward. The old fear returned all at once, sharp and heavy. Evan didn't turn toward her, but his voice stayed steady. "You won't find anyone like that here," he said. The man studied him. "We have records showing a purchase at the border auction. Human buyer. Your name is Evan Cole, yes?" Evan's face stayed calm, though his hands tightened slightly. "I bought her," he said, "but not to own her. She's free now." The man raised an eyebrow. "You understand that property cannot simply be declared free, Mr. Cole?" Lyra felt her chest ache. She wanted to speak, but her voice failed her. Evan took a step closer. "Listen," he said quietly. "She's not property. She's a person. She works here, lives here, and harms no one. You have no right to take her away." The man sighed. "I don't make the rules. We just follow them." Evan folded his arms. "Then maybe your rules are wrong." The air grew tense. The strangers whispered among themselves. Finally, the leader said, "We'll return to our ship and check our orders. Don't leave the valley." They turned and walked back slowly. When they were gone, Lyra ran toward Evan, her hands trembling. "They will come back," she said softly. Evan looked at her with calm eyes. "Maybe, but we'll be ready." That night, the house was quiet. The stars shined bright above the hills, but Lyra couldn't sleep. She sat near the window, her hands pressed together. She felt small again, like she was back in that cold hall waiting for someone to decide her fate. Evan sat at the table reading from his datapad. After a long silence, he said softly, "I won't let them take you." Lyra looked at him, her eyes full of worry. "They said you can't stop them," he smiled faintly. "They said I shouldn't, that's different." She didn't understand how he could sound so calm. "Why do you help me?" she whispered. "Because you deserve to live free," he said simply. "And because I gave my word when I took you from that place." Tears filled her eyes, but she wiped them quickly. "I don't want to be trouble." "You're not trouble," he said. "You're the best thing that happened to this valley." His words made her heart feel warm even through her fear. The next morning, they went about their work as usual. Evan fixed a fence while Lyra tended to the garden, but both kept looking toward the sky, waiting. By afternoon, the silver ship returned. It landed quietly again, sending dust into the air. The same men stepped out, but this time their faces looked uncertain. The leader said, "We've received a message from the capital. They've decided not to pursue the case. The woman is not listed as property anymore. She's registered under your protection." Evan nodded slowly. "Good choice," he said. The man looked around the small farm, then back at Lyra. "You're lucky," he said. "Few get a second chance like this." Lyra didn't answer. She only bowed her head slightly in respect. After they left, the ship rose into the sky and vanished beyond the clouds. For a long moment, neither she nor Evan spoke. The wind moved through the grass, soft and cool. Finally, Lyra whispered, "It's over?" Evan looked toward the horizon. "For now," he said. Then he smiled. "You're free now, truly. No one can claim you again." She stood there quietly, the words sinking into her heart. The fear that had followed her for so long began to fade. That evening, as the sun set, Lyra sat on the porch with Evan. The sky turned gold, and the valley glowed with peace. She said softly, "I was afraid you would let them take me." He looked at her, a gentle smile on his face. "You should know by now, and I don't give up on people." Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time they weren't from fear. "You changed everything," she said. He shook his head. "No, you changed yourself. I just gave you a place to start." They sat there in silence as the light faded. The stars began to shine one by one, the same stars she had once seen from the ship window, the same ones she now looked at from her new home. That night, before going to sleep, Lyra opened her window and looked at the valley below. The air smelled of rain and flowers. Somewhere in the distance she could hear the quiet hum of the power generator and the soft song of night insects. It all sounded like peace. She whispered a small thank you to the stars, and not for saving her, but for guiding her to the one person who had shown her what kindness really meant. Then she closed her eyes and slept deeply, no longer afraid of tomorrow. The morning light came through the ship's window as they entered a quiet planet's orbit. The blue and green surface looked soft and peaceful from above. Clouds floated like white feathers, and a river shined like glass under the sun. Lyra had never seen such a place before. She stood near the glass and watched in silence. Evan sat in the pilot seat, pressing a few buttons. "Welcome to Haven Valley," he said. "Home sweet home." The ship slowly dropped through the clouds. The engines hummed softly, and the land grew clearer. She saw green fields, wooden houses, and hills covered with flowers. It didn't look like any city she had known. It looked alive. When the ship landed on a flat patch near a farmhouse, the door opened with a hiss. Warm air came rushing in, carrying the smell of rain and soil. Lyra stepped out slowly. Her bare feet touched the ground, soft and cool. For the first time in years, she felt grass under her toes. Evan walked out behind her. He stretched his arms and smiled. "Feels good to be back." Lyra looked around. There was a small wooden house with a red roof, a fenced garden, and a few machines standing near the barn. Birds sang in the distance. She didn't know how to speak, but her eyes showed wonder. Evan noticed her expression and said gently, "This place is quiet. You'll like it here." She nodded slowly. Her heart still felt heavy with doubt. But this world looked nothing like the places that had hurt her. It was calm, green, and open. Inside the small house, everything looked simple but clean. A table, 2 chairs, and shelves full of books and tools filled the room. There was a warm smell of wood and old coffee. Lyra stood near the doorway, unsure where to go. "You can take that room," Evan said, pointing to a small door on the side. "It's not much, but it's yours." She stepped inside carefully. The room had a small bed, a window, and a folded blanket. Sunlight came through the curtain, making the air glow soft and gold. She touched the blanket and whispered, "Mine?" Yes, he said from the door. Yours. For a moment she didn't move. The word felt strange. Something she hadn't heard in a long time. Hers. A space that belonged to her. That evening, Evan cooked a simple meal. He placed a bowl in front of her and smiled. Hope you're hungry. She sat down slowly. The food was warm and sweet. She ate quietly, watching him. He didn't eat much, just sipped tea and looked out the window. After dinner, she helped him clean the dishes. When she dropped a cup by accident, it didn't break, but she froze in fear. Her hands trembled. She waited for him to shout, to be angry, but he only said, "Don't worry. Happens to everyone." He picked up the cup and smiled. See, no harm done. She didn't know what to say. Her throat felt tight. No one had ever spoken to her so gently after a mistake. Over the next few days, life in the valley began to feel like a quiet dream. Evan worked outside most mornings, fixing machines or feeding the small animals in the barn. Lyra followed him, trying to help. She learned how to open the grain sacks, how to water the garden, and how to mend small fences. She often made mistakes, but he never shouted. He showed her again and again, his patience endless. Sometimes when she grew tired, he told her to rest. "The work will wait," he'd say. In the evenings, they sat near the porch. The sky turned orange and stars began to appear one by one. Lyra listened to the sound of crickets. She didn't speak much, but her silence was no longer full of fear. One afternoon, a group of villagers came by. They were humans like Evan, but dressed in bright farming clothes. They looked curious when they saw Lyra. Some whispered softly. She lowered her head, afraid of their looks. Evan stood beside her. His tone was calm but firm. "This is Lyra," he said. "She helps me here." The villagers nodded politely, though some still stared. One old woman smiled kindly. "Welcome, dear," she said. "You're safe here." After they left, Lyra looked up at Evan and whispered, "They don't like me?" He shook his head. "They don't understand yet. But give them time. People fear what they don't know. Once they see who you are, they'll stop." His words stayed with her. Days turned into weeks. The valley slowly became familiar to her. She began waking up early to feed the animals. She learned to laugh softly when the small creatures chased each other near her feet. She even began to hum sometimes while working, the same old tune she had once heard Evan sing on the ship. One evening, she found him repairing a small solar pump near the garden. She sat beside him and handed him tools without being asked. When he finished, he said, "You're learning fast." She smiled faintly. "You teach well." He looked up, surprised to see her smile. It was the first time she had done that. "That's good to see," he said. That night, after the work was done, she stood outside the house and looked up at the sky. The stars above Haven Valley seemed closer than ever. She remembered the dark halls of the auction, the cold hands that had pushed her, and the voice that had said she was worthless. Now, standing on this quiet world, she realized she had a place again. Evan came out to stand beside her. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, looking at the sky. "Yes," she whispered. "It's quiet," he nodded. "Quiet is good. Quiet means peace." She turned to him and asked softly, "Why do you live here alone?" He smiled a little. "Because the galaxy is loud. Out there, everyone's chasing something. Power, money, control. I like it here. Things make sense here." Lyra looked back at the stars. "And me?" she asked. He turned to her and said gently, "You belong here too if you want to." The words filled her heart with warmth. She didn't answer, but her eyes glistened under the starlight. Later that night, when she lay on her bed, she thought about all the small things and the smell of grass, the soft sound of rain, the human who gave her food, work and a name again. For the first time in her life, she didn't fall asleep in fear. She fell asleep with a smile. And outside the window, the stars of Haven Valley shined quietly, as if watching over a girl who had finally found a home. The ship moved quietly through the endless dark. Outside the window, stars drifted by like dust made of light. Lyra sat on a small seat near the corner, her blanket still wrapped around her. She could hear the soft hum of the engines and the steady sound of the man walking near the control panel. His name, she remembered, was Evan Cole. He was not like the others she had known. He didn't bark orders or watch her with cold eyes. He worked in silence, adjusting switches and checking screens. Sometimes he would talk to himself, saying things like, "Fuel line stable," or "almost at jump speed." His tone was calm, steady, the voice of someone used to being alone. Lyra watched him carefully. Every move he made seemed careful and gentle. Still, her heart stayed guarded. She didn't understand why he had taken her from that place. No one had wanted her, and yet he had raised his hand. There must be a reason, she thought. People always wanted something in return. Hours passed. Evan glanced back at her and said, "There's food in the compartment to your right. Help yourself if you're hungry." She didn't move. He turned back to his work without saying more. She waited a few minutes, then slowly opened the small metal door beside her. Inside were simple supplies: bread, fruit cubes, a small water pack. She took one piece of bread and nibbled on it quietly. It tasted soft and fresh, not the dry rations she was used to. She felt strange warmth in her chest, not from the food but from the small act of being allowed to eat freely. Later, Evan sat in the pilot seat and leaned back. "You can sleep here," he said. "No one will hurt you on this ship." Lyra stayed awake long after he fell asleep in his chair. She listened to the quiet hum of the ship and tried to believe his words. But the past still lived in her mind. Faces shouting, doors closing, lights flashing. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and watched the stars until sleep finally came. When morning came, or what counted as morning in space, she found Evan making repairs near the engine bay. He was humming softly, a low tune that echoed faintly across the room. His voice wasn't smooth or perfect, but it carried warmth. She stood near the doorway and watched. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He just smiled faintly and said, "Morning. You sleep all right?" She nodded once. He pointed to a small tool on the bench. "Can you hand me that wrench?" She hesitated, unsure which one he meant. He noticed and walked closer, picking it up himself. "That's fine," he said gently. "You'll learn." For a while, she just watched him work. His movements were confident but not rushed. When a small spark flashed from a cable, he laughed softly. "Always something with this old ship," he muttered. Lyra tilted her head. "You fix it yourself?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Evan looked up, surprised to hear her speak for the first time. "Yeah," he said with a smile. "Been flying her for 10 years now. She breaks down, I fix her. Like family, I guess." She didn't understand how a machine could be family, but she didn't ask. His calm way of speaking made her curious, even comfortable. Later that day, as they traveled through a quiet sector of space, a small alarm blinked red on the console. Evan pressed a few buttons, frowning. "Just turbulence," he said calmly. "Hold on." The ship shook lightly. Lyra's hands gripped the armrest, her heart racing. She had been in ships before, but never free like this. Always trapped, always afraid. She looked toward Evan, expecting him to shout or grow angry at the noise. But he didn't. He just steadied the ship and glanced at her. "It's all right," he said softly. "We're fine." His voice was so calm that she slowly loosened her grip. The shaking stopped soon after, and Evan smiled a little. "See, easy." Lyra felt her heart slow down. The fear that had lived in her for so long started to fade just a little. Hours later, he brought her a small cup of tea. "Old Earth recipe," he said. "Not sure if you'll like it." She took it carefully. The smell was strange but pleasant. She tasted it and nodded slowly. "Warm," she said. "Good," he replied with a smile. "That's the point." For a while they sat in silence. The stars moved by outside, glowing and endless. Lyra glanced at him, studying his face. He looked tired but kind. There was no cruelty hiding behind his eyes. He didn't act like a master or a commander. He treated her like someone who mattered. When he noticed her watching him, he chuckled. "You keep looking like you're trying to read my thoughts," he said softly. She turned her face away, shy. "I don't understand you," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "You bought me," she said quietly. "But you don't." "Treat me like the others did." Evan leaned back in his chair and looked at the stars for a long moment before answering. "Maybe that's because I didn't buy you," he said. "I got you out of there." She didn't know what to say. The words felt heavy and strange in her ears. "Why?" she asked at last. "Because nobody deserves to be left behind like that," he said simply. "Not you." "Not anyone." Lyra stared at him. There was no pride in his voice, no expectation of thanks. Just truth. For a long time she stayed quiet. The idea that someone had helped her for no reason didn't make sense. Where she came from, kindness always had a price. But as the hours passed, she began to see small signs that he meant what he said. He gave her space. He never asked her to do things she couldn't. When she tried to clean the small cabin, he just smiled and said, "You don't have to." When she offered to fix something, he taught her instead of scolding her mistakes. That night, she sat near the window and looked at her reflection in the glass. The stars glittered beyond and the ship's hum sounded softer than before. Evan sat in the pilot's seat again, writing something on his tablet. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly. He looked up. "A quiet planet," he said. "Small place. Not many people. You'll like it there." "Why me?" she asked again, unable to stop herself. He smiled faintly. "Because everyone deserves a place where they can start over." The words stayed with her long after he went to rest. She whispered them to herself like a memory she didn't want to lose. For the first time in a long while, she felt something new. Not fear, not confusion. Something softer. Trust. As the ship sailed through the dark sky, Lyra wrapped the blanket tighter around her and closed her eyes. She didn't know what waited on the next world, but she knew this human was not like the others. Maybe, just maybe, this time she had found someone who saw her not as a number but as a person, and that small thought made her heart feel lighter than it had in years. The hall was full of voices, cold and restless. Bright lights hung above rows of metal benches. People from many worlds sat there, whispering and laughing. They were here for the auction, where living beings were sold like items. Most of them were rich traders or travelers looking for someone to serve them. At the center of the stage stood a thin girl with pale silver hair. Her skin had a faint glow and her ears were long and soft like a fox's. She stood with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her head bowed low. She was afraid to look up. Her name was Lyra, though no one in the hall cared to know that. To them, she was only Lot 47. The announcer, a tall man with a shiny coat, spoke loudly through the microphone. He said she came from a far world destroyed in a border conflict. He said she could work, she could learn, she could obey. The crowd stayed silent. No one raised a hand. The announcer forced a smile. He shouted the first price, low enough to catch attention. Still no one answered. The room grew quiet again. Someone laughed from the back row. A man in a blue suit said, "She looks broken." Another one whispered, "She won't last a week." Their words made Lyra's heart sink lower. She wished to disappear. She could hear the announcer's voice rising with frustration. He lowered the price again and again, his smile turning nervous. "Come now, fine people," he said, trying to sound cheerful. "Someone must take her. She is gentle, silent, and well-trained." But no one wanted her. Lyra stood very still. Her eyes stayed down, her hair falling like a curtain around her face. In her mind, she remembered the stories told by others in her camp before they were separated. They said humans were dangerous and cold, that they only saw value in money or power. She believed those words once. Now she only waited for the end of this long humiliation. Minutes passed. The hall began to lose interest. Some buyers stood to leave. The announcer sighed, his patience wearing thin. "All right," he said, "final call. Anyone? Anyone at all?" And then, from the back of the hall, a voice said calmly, "I'll take her." Every head turned toward the sound. It was a human voice, low, clear, and steady. Lyra slowly lifted her head for the first time. There, standing in the shadows near the exit, was a man. His jacket was worn and dusty, his boots scuffed from long travel. His face carried lines of tiredness, but his eyes were calm, kind even. He didn't look rich or proud. He just stood there holding a small tablet that confirmed his bid. The crowd murmured in confusion. "A human?" Someone whispered. "He's serious?" The announcer blinked in surprise. "Sir, you understand what you're buying, yes?" The man nodded once. "Yes," he said simply. The room went silent. The announcer stammered, "Well then, sold. Lot 47 goes to the human." He struck the gavel, his voice uncertain. Lyra felt her knees weaken. She didn't know if this was mercy or another kind of chain. Moments later, the man approached the stage. He gave the payment with quiet words, signed the form, and gestured gently toward the exit. Lyra followed, her steps small and unsure. The crowd parted to let them pass. Some whispered, some laughed softly, but he ignored them all. Outside the hall, the air felt different and cleaner, colder. The night sky above was wide and dark, filled with stars. Lyra wrapped her arms around herself. She expected to be pushed or ordered to move faster. Instead, the man stopped beside a small cargo vehicle and looked at her with calm eyes. "You must be hungry," he said quietly. His voice wasn't harsh. It was even, almost careful. She didn't answer. He opened the back of the vehicle and handed her a small packet of food. It was simple travel rations, the kind given to workers and pilots. She hesitated, staring at it, unsure if it was a trick. "Go on," he said. "Eat." Slowly, she took a bite. It was plain but warm. Her eyes blinked with confusion. No one had spoken to her that way in a long time. The man climbed into the front seat and started the engine. "Name's Evan," he said over his shoulder. "Evan Cole, you can rest in the back seat. We'll be leaving soon." She didn't move. She watched him from behind, his hands steady on the controls, his face quiet under the glow of the dashboard lights. There was no cruelty in him, no anger, just stillness. The vehicle drove through the dark city toward the docking bay. Neon lights passed by the windows like streaks of rain. Lyra leaned against the seat and tried to stay awake, but her body was too tired. She hadn't slept properly in weeks. Her eyes grew heavy, and before long she drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. When she opened her eyes again, they were on a ship. The walls were metallic but old, covered with small scratches and notes scribbled by hand. It smelled faintly of oil and coffee. The hum of the engines was steady, almost like a lullaby. Evan stood near the control panel, checking readings. He looked back at her and said, "You're safe now." She didn't believe him. She had heard those words before, and they never meant what they should. Still, there was something in his voice that made her want to hope. He handed her a blanket. "Rest," he said. "You'll need it." She hesitated again. He wasn't watching her now. He was busy fixing something near the console. She studied him quietly. His jacket had patches from old repairs. His left hand had small scars, the kind earned from hard work, not violence. He looked like a man who built things rather than broke them. The engines roared softly as the ship lifted off the ground. The stars appeared through the window, bright and endless. Lyra pulled the blanket around herself. She didn't know where they were going or what this human wanted with her. But for the first time since her capture, she wasn't in a cage. No guards stood beside her. No cold walls surrounded her, only space, and the sound of a man quietly humming an old song as his ship climbed higher into the dark. Lyra closed her eyes. She told herself not to trust him, not to believe this sudden peace, but deep inside a tiny spark began to glow, something she thought had died long ago. It was hope.